Scott Strazzante is a photojournalist who's worked at the San Francisco Chronicle and the Chicago Tribune. He co-won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 2008. He was awarded the National Newspaper Photographer of the Year in 2000 and was runner-up in 2007. He is an 11-time Illinois Photographer of the Year. Strazzante is a prolific street photographer using his iPhone with the Hipstamatic app. And today, on the Crit House, Scott Strazzante discusses 5 images that have influenced him as a photographer, including work from Gary Winogrand, John H. White, George Silk, Damon Winter, and Soche Nishano. So, Scott Strazzante, it's nice to have you here with us on the Crit House. You are quite the accomplished photographer, and so we're honored to have you join us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about who you are as a photographer and what your career has been like.
Yeah, so just a little background. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My dad was a truck tire dealer. And so the plan was for me to become a tire dealer and went to college to be a business major. And then halfway through college, I stumbled across a gallery show of work by a Chicago Tribune photographer named Paul Giroux. And I'd always brought cameras to sporting events when I was a teenager with my dad and, took photos at frat parties and stuff like that, but never really thought of it as anything more than just a little hobby. And then when I walked into this gallery show, I was just like struck by lightning. It was like, it was just what I wanted to do. I just decided in that moment, this is it. And some of the images I still remember in my mind. There was a St. Francis de Sales high school football game. There was a picture story on a monk, and Paul Giroux was there, and I nervously approached him, and I basically said, "What's the secret recipe? How do I become you?" And because he had gone, I went to Ripon College, which is a small liberal arts college in middle Wisconsin, and he was like, "Well, I don't want to really tell you, how to become a photographer, but this is what I did." And so I kind of followed his path. I went on an urban studies program in Chicago as part of my college. And then I got out of college and I just sent out, not portfolio, I sent out resumes and cover letters to every newspaper in the Midwest.
Wow.
And thinking I would get gobbled up right away. And of course, nothing. But then out of the blue, a guy named Irv Gebhardt at the Milwaukee Journal said, "Hey, bring up your portfolio. We'll take a look at it." And so my portfolio at the time consisted of, photos from the stands at sporting events, a lot of shadows and reflections, and then a photo story I did on public sculpture in Chicago that had no people in it. It was just like, here's the Picasso, here's the Moreau, here's this, here's that. And thankfully, Irv was very kind. And he said, "Oh, you have a good eye. I can tell you have a good eye, but you maybe need a little more experience." And so he said, "Here's a guy in Chicago, John H. White. He Pulitzer Prize winner. He teaches at Columbia College. You should give him a call." And so I called John, and he kind of, I gave my spiel, and he's like, "Nope, you can't come in my class because you don't have any experience. You have to take photo 1 and darkroom 1." And I'm like, "Okay." And so I enrolled in photo 1 and darkroom 1 at Columbia College. I'd never, developed my own film before, none of that stuff. And so that was quite a learning curve. And then about, I would say maybe 2 months into this class, I got a call from a guy at a tiny newspaper in the neighborhood I grew up in. It was called the Daily Calumet. And he's like, "We're looking for a part-time photographer. Why don't you come in?" And so I came in, once again, didn't bring any photos, I don't think. And he's like, "Two questions. Do you know how to use a flash?" And I'm like, "Oh, yes." But of course, I'd never used a flash before, so I lied. And then he asked me, "Do you know how to roll your own film?" And I'm like, "Oh, sure," and like I had no idea what that even meant. And so luckily the photo editor there was a guy named JT Smith who was very kind and patient with me. Um, but at the time, sports, 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 that's all I really wanted to do. I was a big sports fan and I loved shooting sports. And so a newspaper for me was like an excuse to shoot sports. So that first year was all just local high school things. And then, of course, I had all the other newspaper assignments like check passings. The lady at the Red Cross is giving a big check to
Right.
someone and you pose them up and parades and all that stuff. And but then a year in, that newspaper got bought out by a bigger newspaper called the Daily Southtown, which was a suburban newspaper, and they covered professional sports. And this was 1980, 87, 88. And so right when Michael Jordan got to the Bulls.
Yep.
And so there I was, shooting the NBA Finals with Michael Jordan, and just kind of learning on the fly, and then spent a long 11 years at the Daily Southtown. It wasn't a great photo paper, but I got to shoot my sports. And then all of a sudden I started looking at other people's work and realizing there was more to photography or photojournalism than sports, and looking at um, contest winnings. Because back then, before the internet, the only way to kind of see good photographs was to get the World Press photo book or the Pictures of the Year book. And I just kind of, learned by looking at other people's photography. And then in the late 90s, I got hired at a tiny paper in Joliet, Illinois, which was just phenomenally um, regarded in the photojournalistic world. And I was 35, 36 at the time, and everyone else was there in their early 20s, like right out of college. But there were some great photographers there. Todd Heisler from the New York Times, um, John Lowenstein, who's a really fabulous freelance photographer. Brian Plonka was just amazing. Just so many really talented photographers. Eris Economopoulos was in Springfield, part of our chain. And so it just was a fabulous place to learn. It was like those 3 years there were like my college experience because I didn't have any photo training. So I kind of learned late kind of how to do photojournalism, where before I was kind of just doing photography. And then luckily won National Newspaper Photographer Year in 2000. And then the Chicago Tribune said, oh, maybe we should hire you. And then I got to the Tribune and spent a great 13 years there. And then finally moved on to the San Francisco Chronicle 10 years ago. So it's been quite a exciting, ride for me, and got to experience a lot of things and go to a lot of places. But I kind of at some point kind of got tired of newspaper photography, because for me, I was always kind of shooting for what my editor wanted or what the writer wanted, or or what I kind of in my head thought that was expected of me. So I started just kind of branching off and doing my own personal projects. And I did a long-term project on a farm that turned into a
This was when you
subdivision.
were still at the Chronicle?
So this started, I would say, when I was at the Tribune is when I kind of started doing my
Okay.
own personal projects. Um, Before that, I think I was just kind of, I've always been a rule follower. I'm just like a worker bee. And so I never really thought of expanding my photography behind, kind of beyond newspaper photography. And then at the Tribune, I don't even know what kind of sparked it, but I started doing street photography in about 2012, which is something I'd never done before. And then I had the long-term project on which is Common Ground, which I did from 1994 to 2020 something. Ended up being a 27-year long project. That was something I kind of just brought from newspaper to newspaper, but that was very photojournalistic, senior citizen cattle farmers struggling, selling their land, a subdivision being built, and then following a family in that subdivision. But then along the way, I started doing abstract ocean photography. I really got interested in not really, like I think I got so not burned out, that's too strong of a word, but when you do photo stories, especially intimate photo stories, you kind of start gathering extended family members because you spend 2 months or 6 months or a year or 8 years with a family and you become part of their group. And when you know that you're going to photograph something for a year and then you're going to leave the people and they'll never probably see you again, I, at least personally, started feeling really bad about that. Like, I think the one story that broke my heart was um, when I was at the Tribune, there was a man who was a high school wrestling coach. He got hit by a car and died, and he left behind a wife and four kids under the age of 6, I believe. And so my assignment was to go to their home. The community was rallying around them. They were having a big fundraiser. So I was sent to their house just to photograph them, the old fake, oh, maybe we'll play Monopoly while you're here, or I'll take them to the park, kind of this fake reality that newspapers sometimes are forced to do. And I walked into the door, I met the mother, and I turned the corner in the living room, and there was this little girl, Addison, and she's just kind of sprawled out on her couch in a photo of her dad, like right on the nightstand there, or right on the side table. And I immediately just like took a couple photos of it. And as the day went on, I kind of realized this girl, Addison, was the story. In my head, I'm like, this is Daddy's little girl. She was the oldest daughter, and she seemed most affected by the loss of her dad. And so I pitched to my newspaper, hey, you know, can I follow this family for the next 9 months, on and off, not like every day, until the 1 year anniversary of the death? And at the time that, the Tribune, my boss, Todd Panagopoulos, super encouraging and let us do a lot of stuff on our own. And so I spent the next 9 months photographing this family. And the two youngest girls were like 2 and 3. And so when I first met them, they punched me and they kicked me and they were just like they seemed really angry, of course, because they lost their dad. So I kind of in my head figured, they're kind of lashing out at me like some sort of father figure or an adult male coming to the house. And then it kind of switched. Then all of a sudden I would come over and they would just start hugging me and they wouldn't let go. And and I have two kids of my own, and so it just is, where I'm very comfortable around children. And so these kids were just great. And I traveled with them. We went to Disney World on the 1 year anniversary of the dad's death. But then I knew I was going to leave them, and I knew that, once that the story was over, they weren't going to see me anymore. And it really struck me. I'm like, with these girls in particular, am I kind of reinforcing their life that men leave? Like their
Yeah.
dad died and he left, and then I spent a year, 9 months with them, and then all of a sudden, where'd Scott go? And so I don't know if I'm just kind of overplaying my role in their lives, but it just really kind of struck me, and it that like it takes a lot of emotional toll to do these stories the right way, and I still do them occasionally. But I don't like really kind of search them out because I've kind of now, and the whole gist of that long story was that, I now kind of focus on like I'm doing a series of photos of bus shelters in San Francisco, at night, just kind of, or going to the beach and just photographing slow shutter speed waves, So I think I'm kind of doing my own therapy through photography to kind of, deal with, some of the kind of abandonment issues I have with the people that I spend a lot of time with.
So, Scott, we've asked you to choose five images here on the Crit House to talk about those things that have influenced you on your creative journey. What did you think about when you were deciding on what those images would be?
Yeah, I think I kind of broke down in my head like what are the kind of major themes of my photography over the years and how I've kind of evolved, and what were some of the kind of markers in my career that really influenced me and have kind of stuck with me through time and also kind of re-energized me at certain times. Some of these influences, happened within the last 10 years. And so, it wasn't all like I had five influences right as I started out, and then that's it. I've been
Right.
influenced over time by a lot of these, but it definitely, I think, by looking at this work of these five photographers, it's kind of changed. It's given me permission, I think, to be more creative and kind of following my own vision. Because I think we all, when we start out, we all kind of maybe even unintentionally start copying other people. We see, like, I remember seeing a rodeo photo in Pictures of the Year that won first place. And I was like, I got to go shoot more rodeo. The reason I'm not being successful is that I don't shoot enough rodeo. And then the next year, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, wait, no, it's, you know, table tennis. Why have I not been shooting ping pong all these years? And so, and so then after a while, if you're doing it the right way, you stop copying people, but you still continue to be inspired by them. And it encourages you to just kind of do things your own way. And that's something where, I think even when I am, kind of copying someone else, not literally, but I can kind of still make it my own, and that's always been something that I've gotten a big kick out of. whether doing diptychs or doing street photography or doing slow shutter speed stuff, is when other people then go out and kind of do that. They always give, homage to me. Oh, doing some Scott Strazzante style street photography, and that's always like a great honor that, that people, so I find out that I'm inspired them to kind of expand their photo view. And so that's the biggest compliment to me, is when someone, goes out and starts doing something that I just did, even though I'm probably doing something that thousands of other people have done before.
Well, you know what they say, there's nothing new under the sun, whether it's
That is true.
music or movies or poetry or whatever, but got to keep going ahead. Let's take a
Yeah.
look at your five images, Scott. So, Scott, Gary Winogrand has been featured on this program on a number of occasions. This is the first time anyone has chosen a color image of his, and certainly the first time anyone's chosen this one, and I love it. So tell us about why this one is here for you.
So first, about Gary Winogrand. When I was a teenager, no interest in photography, but a big fan of television. Um, I was just switching around the five channels we had, back then: ABC, CBS, NBC, Channel 9, WGN, and Channel 11 in public TV in Chicago. I came across this series of shows on different types of photographers. And, there was like a spot news photographer, there was a fashion photographer, sports photographer, and then all of a sudden one day an episode came up of this strange man wandering around the city taking pictures of the oddest things I've ever seen in my life. I wasn't a big photography nerd back then, so I didn't even know street photography existed. And so just to kind of see this guy, taking these photos, and they shared, the photo of the couple with the chimpanzee, and some of his other work. I think there was one in Texas of I think a veteran that like had nothing below the waist and stuff like that, just sitting on the street and stuff. And so it was just for me like, what in the world is this, and who is this guy? And I really didn't think of it much more, until years, decades later, until I started doing street photography. And when I realized at the time that this crazy man was Gary Winogrand, then I started kind of researching, his body of work. And of course, I love his black and white street photography, and that's been a big influence. But the cover of his book, 1964, for me is, and this is this image, it is the type of photography I love. It's complex but simple at the same time. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, a very industrial landscape, so I really kind of feel like I've been influenced by minimalism. And also, I think the biggest thing is, when I was a child, probably from about 5 through 15, every single summer, me, my two sisters, my mom, my dad, and my mom's mom and dad would get in a station wagon, a Country Squire station wagon, and we would go on a 2-week road trip across the United States. And we meticulously planned them so we got to every of the 48 contiguous states, the lower provinces of Canada, and just got all over the world. And I mean, all over the country. And I just loved looking out the window at America going past, and loved going to rest areas and having lunch, because my mom, bless her soul, just like the cheapest woman in the world, so like everything was bologna sandwiches and you know 2-day old bread and stuff like that. But so we ate at every rest area in America, I think. And so just this image, it just harkens back to me to those family road trips that we had as a kid. And I think it really was, those road trips are kind of the foundation of me being a photographer, because I just loved looking at things, and just being, and America is such a diverse, amazing country, and every place we went was just something different and unusual. And so, I think that, when I first saw this image, I just was like, it just spoke to me on so many different levels. And plus, it's probably my favorite photo book too. 1964 is the year I was born. And so it just has all these kind of, confluences that just really have, influenced me greatly. Yeah,
Uh,
like my two kids, they're now 29 and 27, but I was a single dad from when they were 4 and 6 on. And I didn't take them anywhere in the car until much later. I was establishing my career and pawning them off on relatives and things like that, but we didn't really start driving until when my daughter went to UCLA, and so I drove her out to California and back a couple times, and my son came with. But yeah, kind of looking back, I was just like, I think I failed to try to, give him the childhood that I had, which I love so much.
Your second image, you referred to John H. White previously, and this is one from him. Tell us about this image and Mr. White.
Yeah, so I think that my little soapbox of newspaper photographers are so underappreciated in the grand scope of photography. If you go in a book and it says the 100 greatest photographers or the 100 greatest women photographers, it's always war photographers or fashion photographers, Annie Leibovitz or James Nachtwey, even though James did start at newspapers. It just, there's not, for some reason, there's not that romance and glamour of being a daily newspaper photojournalist. But I don't think there's a better, you know, talented group than the newspaper photographer because you have to do something different every single day. One day you are a food photographer, the next day you're a fashion photographer, then you're a sports photographer, then you're a news photographer, sometimes all in the same day. And so, I've always felt that newspaper photographers have been undervalued. Um, like when you think of the great photojournalists, Carol Guzzi should be one of the first people that comes to mind,
Yep.
or there's just so many great ones, Wally Scally in LA, or, and especially in the Midwest, the Chicago photographer, although probably known in the city, not very well known on the coasts. And so when I started into newspapers in the late 80s in Chicago, it was just an amazing time. The Chicago Sun-Times had a fantastic photo staff led by John White, who won the Pulitzer in 1978, not for a picture or a specific story. He won with a portfolio of images of daily life in Chicago. It was photos like this of just kids playing outside Cabrini Green, one of the housing projects, and then there was just amazing sports photographers that I kind of sat next to and heard their stories, and so the newspaper photographers of Chicago, kind of raised me, and it was a different era too. Unfortunately, it was like a lot of just white males. So it was great, for John White, a person of color, to be one of the leading photographers. And so now, like the staff I work with, the San Francisco Chronicle, it's amazing. I'm the only white photographer, the only white male photographer. We have such a great diverse group, and at the Tribune, it just was mostly white males. But anyways, back to Chicago and being influenced by these photographers. John was definitely someone that I was always kind of just intimidated by because he was so great. But I got to do a story on him for News Photographer magazine, photograph John White. And so I spent a little bit of time with him Easter morning at Lake Michigan because every day he gets up and sees the sunrise at Lake Michigan. And I got to hang out with him and watch him work and stuff like that. And so now he's like one of my dearest friends, and he's just the kindest, most gentle soul, but just super talented. And I had the honor of going to his home once. He lives in this apartment that is basically a John H. White museum. It's amazing. All his pictures are everywhere. Every once in a while, he'll write me a letter, which of course, touches me and also humbles me because it's like I don't write letters to anyone, and but it's just really sweet. And so, of all the Chicago photographers that influenced me and still continue to influence me, John H. White is the greatest. And if you've never heard of him, please look him up and seek him out if you see that he's going to be speaking in your community or something. He's just a phenomenal human being and a great photographer too.
George Silk.
When I started out as a sports photographer, it was all action, action, action. That's all I wanted to do. Tight is right. Just a really tight shot of Michael Jordan, slam dunking the ball, or ball on bat for baseball and stuff like that. And I never ever thought of sports more as life and more of as the fan experience. And George Silk, this image of these students in the University of Pittsburgh watching the World Series game, I still am just kind of astounded just by the angle of it. It almost seems like they're 1,000 feet in the air, and not only is it just composed so beautifully? It's just the body language is fantastic. Just the kind of the cheering and almost the kind of the roller coaster of the arms. It's just such a beautiful image. And images like this really kind of inspired me to turn around at a sporting event and look into the stands or to go up into the stands and incorporate fans into it. And I think, being a kid who was born and raised basically in Comiskey Park in Chicago, I'm sadly a big Chicago White Sox fan and went to a ton of games there as a kid. I had this kind of in hindsight, this kind of missed opportunity. Like why wasn't I interested in photography earlier? Why didn't I photograph at Comiskey Park? The park ended up being knocked down in 1990,
Yep.
and I spent 2, 3 years shooting games there, and I never once thought of documenting the park. And so it was something that I was like, oh, what a missed opportunity, and kind of I kind of wavered back and forth between this George Silk image and an image by Peter Elliott, who was an architectural photographer in Chicago who did a book called Park Life, which is he spent the summer of 1977 at Comiskey Park photographing the fans, just the fans. And it's just a tremendous book. The great thing about the summer of 77 was the White Sox were good for the first time in like 20 years. People were coming out to the ballpark in droves where the place used to be just empty. But it was such a great era because people didn't do what they do now, dress up fully in a uniform and a hat. And, you go to a professional sporting event today and it's just like, come on, guys, you're 49 years old. You don't have to wear a jersey. It's just like, come on. And so, but these photos are just like, a plumber getting off work or a family coming from church or the local butcher and stuff. And so just like there's so much character in these South Chicagoites, it always felt like, oh man, I really missed this opportunity to document this great ballpark. And so when I got to the Bay Area in 2014, my first assignment at the Oakland Coliseum, I was just like, oh my God, this reminds me of Comiskey Park. It's made out of concrete. It's run down. It smells like urine. It's just like it's exactly like Comiskey. And so it was almost that day. I'm like, I'm gonna do the photo story of the Oakland Coliseum that I didn't do on Comiskey Park. So at that time, in 2014, I was a couple years into doing street photography with the Hipstamatic app on the iPhone and
Yep.
shooting black and white squares. And so I decided I was going to do this Coliseum project with my iPhone with just squares. So I just started, I'd be assigned a game. And so I'd get there 2 hours early and I'd just wander around in the stands beforehand, or I'd go out in the parking lot and just basically doing street photography at a professional sports arena. And so I just kept collecting images and collecting images and collecting images. And then there was rumors, okay, well, the A's are finally going to build a new ballpark. And so there was all these plans of building a ballpark on the water or by this one college and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden it shifted where it's like the owner said, no, we're moving to Las Vegas. And I was like, oh no, and so then bad news, good news was it was sad that these amazing Oakland A's fans were losing their team, which I could not imagine if like the Chicago White Sox had left when I was a kid. But good news, I finally had like an ending point for this project. It was like, okay, now I can just focus everything on the last season in 2024 and just kind of then publish a book. And so the whole last season, I doubled my efforts and started actually for the first time talking to a lot of the fans, which before I just would walk around and steal photos. But now I started kind of talking to fans and I met a lot of great guys and women. And so then now I'm like a month away from the book being published. It's called Baseball's Last Dive Bar,
Oh,
which was a name that the fan organization there kind of coined, and they're called Last Dive Bar. And so that's a kind of a self-published book that I'm doing that'll be out in about a month. So all of this like kind of sports as life type of thing is where I really am now, where, yeah, I still shoot sports action, which is kind of empty calories and, maybe one or two photos a year have some resonance. But going to a kid's house who trains in a boxing ring in his dad's backyard, like that's what I love doing. And
yeah.
so it's just kind of how does sports affect a person's life is where my angle is now when I shoot sports instead of just, ooh, who hit it the home run or who scored the touchdown.
Let's move on to your next. You were talking about shooting with the Hipstamatic on your iPhone, and I believe this is in that same process from Damon
Yes.
Winter. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, so in the photojournalism world, this was so controversial. So this was, I believe, 2010. Damon Winter, fantastic photographer, was at the LA Times and now is at the New York Times. He was in Iraq, I believe, Afghanistan. I can't remember which one. And so he started doing, just kind of these slice of life photos with his iPhone with the Hipstamatic app. And he entered them in the Pictures of the Year International contest, and he won a third prize in like news picture story. And people just lost their shit. They're just like, this is unethical. This is over filtered. It's not fair. It's not fair that he won this award. It's not fair, and it's just like, come on, it's like, why do we have to be just like in this box where it's like, this is what photojournalism is, and if you go outside of it, you're going to get slapped down. And I probably, at the same time was kind of like, this was 2 years before I started shooting with the Hipstamatic, where I probably at the same time was probably with them, like, this is not right. And then, I kind of realized it's like, well, why? Like, who's telling us how to shoot things? And if you feel something looking at a photograph, does it really matter if how it was shot? Does it matter if it was on an iPhone? Does it matter? And there's still always this great stigma of iPhone photography. It's like, oh, you're a hack if you use your iPhone. And I like was such became such a big advocate of the Hipstamatic app. They ended up like naming a lens and a film combo after me, which was kind
Wow.
of funny. Yeah, so I think there was originally a John S lens, and then they named one called the Scott S lens. And my film is like an infrared film, so now I don't use it very often, but if I go to a baseball game, especially at Oracle Park and where the San Francisco Giants play, usually before the games, I'll do some infrared of the baseball field because it just turns all white and it looks really cool. But I don't think for me, I don't find it unethical. I don't find like I'm changing reality. I just feel like I'm using a tool that kind of, makes it look like how I see it. And so, I think Damon Winter was someone who, being an influence for all his other fantastic photography, he's done a lot of great political work in the recent years, but just kind of gave me permission to kind of step outside the box and just say, screw you. If you think this is unethical, oh well, do what you want to do. But for me, this is something I want to explore, and this is something that, I find interesting. And plus, I love shooting with the iPhone because I'm invisible to people.
Yeah.
I can stand next to them at the bus stop and take their photo for 10 minutes and they have no idea. And of course, though, the POY contest that this won, they they determined that was illegal now. So you could not enter a photo like this in the contest anymore. They would kick it out right away.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And then my Common Ground project, which I ended up doing with diptychs, I won Community Awareness Award for that in 2008, I believe. Then the next year they said you can't have diptychs anymore, and so it's just like, because people complained, they're like, not fair. It's not fair. And so whatever. It's like, I know the rules of it, and I guess I have to go along with it. But still, I just think it's kind of ridiculous that the photojournalism community at large tries to, you know, restrain people from being creative. I think there's room, even though it is journalism, I think there is room for personal expression.
Well,
Whatever.
it's a good transition to your fifth image, which I don't think anyone would call photojournalism, but it's certainly creative in its presentation. Tell us about this one and why this is here for you.
This is this is such brilliant work. So this was 2016. I was on a date. I took a woman to SF MoMA, and we were just walked into this room, and all of a sudden Sohei Nishoni's work is on the walls. And, from a distance, it's like, oh, this is cool. It looks like an overhead view of San Francisco. And then there was one, I think, of Paris and, Tokyo and things like that. But then when you got right next to it, you realize that this is a collage made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of images that he made in San Francisco or whatever city it was. if you could blow this up, you would see that like every little part of the city is actually photographed, like almost on the map exactly where it is, but it's just a mind bender. It's like
Yeah.
it's hard to tell by looking at this, of all the little pieces of it. But I think he just kind of goes around, and he uses some sort of GPS to map the city. And so when he's making his photos, he kind of is able to put them into the proper place in the cityscape. And I saw a little video of him putting one of these together like a time lapse, and it was just fascinating. But in San Francisco is the perfect city because it's kind of 7 by 7 miles. It's just kind of, it's an islandish. And, of course, there's the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge. And I don't know if Alcatraz is in there somewhere, but it has like all the highlights, but it is so cool. It's like it's one experience to step back and look at it, but when then you move in close, it's a whole nother experience. And if I ever become a millionaire, I'm gonna buy one of these prints. I don't know if they're where I would even get it, but it, it it was such a revelation to me seeing this work. It just blew me away. And um, you know, I've not really. I've done a couple little collages with um, my ocean photography, but this is not something that I feel like I'm going to try to copy or do similar work. I just look at it in
I don't know how you
awe.
could.
Yeah, it is, and this is what I feel is so amazing about photography is that every single person has a different view of the world. You could spend your life with three other people and go at the same place every day, and everyone would come up with a different view of what the world is to them. And th this work for me just is kind of reinforces just how amazing photography is. And what people always argue is photography art. And I don't really have time to even have an argument about that, but this is one of the most phenomenal pieces of art I've ever seen. And just just to just not know it existed, and then one day, like, oh my God, this is just
Yeah.
amazing. So it just, I still get chills looking at it. It just excites me so much.
Five great images and just a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the Crit House. It's been a
Uh,
pleasure.
I really enjoyed it, and I stumbled upon myFIVE a couple weeks ago, and now I'm addicted. And started out with my friend Pete Souza, and now kind of spreading my wings out to other photographers that I've never been exposed to. So it's a wonderful service you're doing for the community. Thank you, sir.
Well, oh no, thank you for saying it because it's an education for me, and I learn every single time I talk to somebody like you. I learn something that I didn't know or hadn't considered, or a photographer I hadn't seen, and you certainly were absolutely the case in spades. So thank you so much,
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
and thank you all for watching the Crit House.